Okay, folks. Welcome to this afternoon session on tackling far-right ideologies. Before we start, a couple of things. One, there's a code of conduct in the chat, which we'd like you all to observe. We want good discussion, but people need to remember to respect each other. If you've got comments, obviously put them in the chat. If you've got questions, can you please put them in the question and answer box. This event is being recorded, but also if you want to post on social media, you can use the hashtag Organise 2020. We've got a great panel of speakers here this afternoon. Basically, this session is about tackling far-right or right-wing ideology. What we've seen over a number of years now is the growth of right-wing populist movements and parties. They've gained electoral success in many countries in Europe, and a growing number of working people, including trade unionists, are being attracted to that kind of populist discourse. And we don't only see it, in European countries. Obviously, we see it here. That discourse is based on simplistic promises for better pay, job security, and the increase of public provision. But behind it is a sort of ethnocentric worldview promoted in part by mainstream political parties as well as the radical right. And clearly that clashes with democratic and pluralistic values of the trade union and labour movement in the UK and the rest of the world. So this session will address what practical steps unions need to take to promote our values of solidarity and fight against exploitation and discrimination, and examine how we politically educate our members. It's not enough for us just to be saying, well, actually, we don't like the far right or far right politics. We have to do more than that to get people on side. So I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, Richard Denchie. Richard is a researcher, works a lot with German trade unions, and is also a journalist and campaigner in Germany against anti-racism and anti-fascism. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to this webinar. We are kindly asked to be very brief, so I will concentrate on 4 comments. Let me start with the situation in Germany, which has changed during the corona crisis. Germany is not as much infected as other countries, and the economic recession is not as deep as it is in Italy, Spain, France, or Great Britain, for example. Politically, the Christian Democrats are the winner and Merkel their champion. In this respect, the crisis functions as a momentum for the political executive. All other parties are losing support, including the radical right, the so-called alternative for Germany, going down from 15 to 10% in recent opinion polls. Some say the extreme right exceeded its peak nowadays. I think it's too early to give the all clear, for at least 2 reasons. We are still within crisis, it's not over. There are more breakdowns and layoffs to come. A stress test will this be for the coalition government. But even if Merkel succeeds to overcome the crisis better than others, we will get the bill for all the hundreds of billions spent to speed up the economy. Who will pay for this? Is austerity coming back? That means the political situation in autumn and winter, again, might be quite different to what is happening right now. Merkel could lose some of her credibility and legitimacy. A window of opportunity for the far right might open again. That leads to the second remark. politics of the radical right are changing. It's getting more radical, even fascist. But the more interesting point is they try to stick to social topics nowadays. To a certain extent, they try to conquer welfare policy, pensions, health system, etc. We might call this exclusive welfare policy. Exclusive because it's not at all universal. Instead, it's promoting new cleavages, advocating the old story of we against the others, insiders against migrants, people versus establishment, hardworking men against LGBTQ. This happens in Denmark and Sweden. It's part of the struggle inside the Rassemblement National in France, part of the success story of Fidesz in Hungary. I think the most interesting event in this respect took place in Rome this week. Three parties of the right, Forza Italia, Lega, and the so-called Brothers for Italy, started their campaign for the elections in September. Migration is not longer their core issue. The central message is, I quote, "Let's get together for the working Italy." Here, nation, work, and unity are condensed. The extreme right is attacking some of the value of the political left. And this is a crucial constellation, especially for trade unions. Therefore, third remark, up to 25% of trade union members, 25% of trade union members voted for the extreme right in Eastern Germany in elections last year. On the other hand, trade unions are essential in fighting the extreme right, organizing demonstrations and campaigns, building alliances against the authoritarian landslide. The idea of demonstrations is to attack the far right as a political force and as a political party. But what happens inside the factories? There has always been some sort of everyday racism at the shop floor, but it has grown and it's much more openly addressed. When trade union officials criticize the AfD, they are confronted with the counter-argument that trade unions should be neutral in party politics. Therefore, some work councils don't deal with these topics any longer. The background is insecurity, I think. The systemic feeling of losing control at the workplace, the loss of recognition, even by working harder, being more flexible, being more agile, losing perspective. What skills and qualifications do I need? What will be the outcome of digitalization, a big discussion in German trade unions, and the loss of tradition. In former times, being a worker was an expression of pride. Nowadays, it's an attribute of being suspended and delinked. This is at least part of the fertile soil on which the far right is presenting their promise to bring security back in. The far right, the fight against the far right should not be a fight in civil society alone. It has to be a fight in civil society, but not alone. It also has to be taking place at the shop floor. And therefore, my last point. Activists of the far right try to develop an image which goes like this. We care about you. We listen to what you are saying. We take your problems seriously, no matter if they are big or small. We oppose the establishment while work councils and trade unions are making their deals with the management. What could be done by trade unions? Some final remarks according to the discussions we have in Germany here. First, organizing, getting visible also in medium and smaller companies. Without members and activists, there may be no one to disagree when xenophobic prejudices are promoted. Second, those guys at the shop floor, they need strong support. This could be done by trade union task forces, supporting those work councils, when activists of the extreme right try to establish their networks. Third, this year, the German Metal Workers Union introduced a steering committee, which will coordinate all activities in this respect, as a matter of transparency and learning from each other. Fourth, don't rely too much on politics by representation. Trade unions and work councils should be as near to the workplace as possible. This is not an easy task. We need activists who are more closely linked to the shop floor, more bottom-up strategy. Fifth, it has been a hard time for trade union educational centers in recent years. Less money, less political education. A turnaround is necessary. More political seminars and discussions. Six, only half of the experience, almost half of the experiences of ethnical and racist discrimination is taking place at workplaces. At the same time, 25% of the members in work councils in Germany have a migration background. They should be supported much stronger. They are more convincing, more authentic. 7, bringing confidence, security, recognition, and control back in. New concepts of economic democracy should be elaborated. There are discussions about this in Germany and in Italian trade unions. Last point, trade unions should give a proper answer to the European developments. Learn from each other. Possibly you have much better best practices than we have in Germany. There should be transnational cooperation between trade unions and work councils on company and industrial level. After Brexit, cooperation between trade unions is much more necessary than before. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. I mean, I think you made some important points there about what it is that we need to do. And clearly one of the trade unions are political organisations and we need to act politically. But one of the things you talked about was being more visible and getting organised. And I think I want to introduce Sarah Wooley, the General Secretary of the Bakers Union, who over the last few years, especially in terms of precarious workers, have been doing just that. Sarah.
Thanks, Wilf, and thank you for the invitation to come along and speak this afternoon. Tackling the far right is not a new issue that trade unions face, and every few years they tend to find something to latch onto, to present themselves as one of us, like Richard was saying, bringing everyone together. But in reality, as we know, they seek to divide us, usually focusing on the fact that anyone that doesn't look like them or speak like them can't possibly stand with them, and in some cases become aggressive towards those who challenge their views, which we've seen a few times over the last few years. The problem is, as we know, that they're making grounds in our movement, especially now, and especially utilising social media and using messages that Richard outlined, are drawing people in who in the main think they are being supportive to the whole movement by saying things like, but to me all lives matter, right through to giving some the confidence to post comments that are quite frankly nothing but racist. And I don't think there's a union out there that isn't experiencing this at different levels. We have to, as a union and the wider movement as a whole, educate our members better around institutional structural racism, because for so many it's that ingrained into everyday life it's not visible. And about white privilege, making sure that even those on minimum wage bordering on poverty understand their privilege still allows them to walk safely down the street without fear of being stopped and searched simply because of the colour of their skin. We need to reinforce the fact that solidarity locally, regionally, nationally and internationally is the backbone of our movement, as we are stronger together. And we also, frankly, have to weed out those that are far-right fascists out of our movement because they've got no place within it. As a union, the Bakers have for many years have worked mainly locally as issues are raised to tackle far-right ideologies. I remember just after the referendum working with a branch near where I live that has an amazingly diverse workforce. I think there's people from over 30 different countries work within one factory, and it's fantastic. But there were tensions bubbling away before the referendum between some of the different cultures, and after the referendum it did nothing to dispel them. If anything, it aggravated things further, as we saw elsewhere. I attended the site as an official and worked with the employer, the branch reps and some of the members on ways in which we could dissolve some of the tensions. And led by the members and the reps, we decided that the place where people were together most was the canteen. And we looked into the possibilities of educating people and bringing them together through food. Everybody in the Bakers likes food. It worked really well, and people were encouraged to bring in their favourite family recipe with some information about its origin. They also identified as a group all of the religious festivals that were celebrated and focused on them too, with information about them displayed in the canteen. It helped in many ways to refocus conversations away from people being different in a negative way, to how enjoying a plate of food that they maybe would have never normally tried brought people together and created some commonality between them that they hadn't seen before, which sowed the seeds for some other conversations around sports, but that's a completely different divisional conversation. Don't get me wrong, it didn't encapsulate everyone or solve every problem, but we certainly made good grounds to move forward from. And we've had discussions internally for a while about how we engage specifically our Black and ethnic minority members more. We have a diverse group of paid officials, but in the main a less diverse activist base, apart from in the fast food and hospitality section of our membership, which seems to have bucked the trend. COVID, as we've all seen, has highlighted the vast inequality in our society and has sparked louder conversations in our movement about what we can and should be doing to support our BAME members better. Then we saw the horrific murder of George Floyd and the subsequent action by Black Lives Matter, which empowered initially our fast food members to create their own BAME committee to look at how they as a group of workers with the support of the wider union could stand in solidarity and support other BAME workers in fast food and hospitality here and around the world who felt that they'd been thrown to the wolves through the pandemic but also lived daily with racism. We already had links with the SAIU in America through the McStrike campaign, so it was only natural that we would offer our solidarity and support to their members taking action on the back of their treatment through the pandemic, but also as the Black Lives Matter action progressed. So much so that next Sunday on the evening of the 19th of July, the night before the strike for Black Lives Action in America led by the SAIU, the committee are holding a Zoom rally in support of with speakers from here in America to discuss how we forge a path forward collectively to demand racial and economic justice in the workplace and wider society. But it doesn't stop there, and it can't stop there. We've also set up a BAME network in the wider membership, led by one of our paid officials, Haroon Rashid, and supported by our Vice President, Mandy Ambrose. We are hoping that the network will grow and that Haroon and Mandy will be able to feed back to the Executive Council the barriers that are in place, not only in our industry, but our union as well, preventing BAME members from participating and progressing, so that we can be better and force the employers in the food industry to be too. We're hoping that they will highlight issues that we should be focusing on and supporting by developing campaigns like those in the fast food and hospitality sector, and help us educate our members wider about the issues I mentioned earlier by giving us stories about their experiences of racism and not having white privilege, and the impact that that has on their lives, both in and out of work, because it's an extremely powerful way to get the message through to those that are on the border of not knowing how to kind of how to behave. As a white woman, even as General Secretary, it would be wrong of me to presume to know what any of that may look like or to have all the answers. But myself and the National President and the Executive Committee want to make sure that our organisation is fully inclusive, that it is anti-racist and truly reflects the diverse industry we work in and the members we represent, because that's the only way that we're going to help build workers' solidarity and minimise the right-wing divide and rule narratives, as we are and we always will be stronger together. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I mean, and thanks for that example of what you're doing internationally as well. We had a webinar earlier in the week where we were concentrating on, where we were discussing the need to build those international links and that international solidarity, because clearly, very much in some industries, there's like a reformulation of almost like an international working class when you look at companies like McDonald's. But I'm going to move on quickly and introduce the next speaker, Stiofán Nolan, who's from Trademark. Trademark are sort of the anti-racist, anti-fascist, anti-sectarian unit of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, have done a lot of work both amongst trade unions and in the community in terms of having those difficult conversations to try and convince people that actually that they need to be rather than right-wing politics. Over to you.
Cheers, Wilf, and thanks to the TUC for the invitation to speak today. Trademark, as Wilf said, is the anti-sectarian, anti-kind of racist unit of the Irish labour movement. We are kind of the task force of the trade union movement that Richard referred to earlier. From our base in West Belfast on the Falls Shankill interface, for almost 3 decades now, we've been at the forefront of providing a trade union response to the kinds of challenges that Northern Ireland, as you can imagine, throw up for trade unionists. In particular, we've got a singularly unique background in dealing with workplace conflict, particularly in the context of serious sectarian disruptions and indeed racist harassment and intimidation of workers by other workers, of workers by management, and indeed unique to us by paramilitary organisations. And we are, of course, still called upon to respond to threats and the breakdown in relationships in workplaces, though of course that's got significantly better over the last 15 years. Indeed, one of the successes, I would argue, of the peace process here has been the proactive role of trade unions in transforming workplaces that were particularly partisan and exclusive and closed off to some communities to ones which are far more open, diverse and integrated. I'll give you a practical example of our work, if I may. A few years ago, there was a major incident, well, a small incident initially at ASDA retail store in North Belfast, and it wasn't dealt with properly by anybody who was involved. Staff became divided along sectarian lines. There was a local boycott of the store by thousands of customers. There was paramilitary involvement. There was unofficial stoppage. There was a picket of the store. Local politicians got involved. The CEO of ASDA came in from Britain, then the owners, Walmart, flew in from America. It was a bit of a nightmare. At that point, of course, when the what's name has hit the fan, we get a phone call, usually about 2 months too late to do anything of value. But in this instance, we went in to mediate to try and resolve that dispute and to rebuild relationships between workers who were, by the way, members of the same union. You have to remember that. And what we did after the mediation period was, I suppose it was solid, sometimes old-fashioned trade union political education. We got people in a room, half-day sessions, 15 workers per session, very strong message delivered by us. Over 4,000 workers went through that program, managers and supervisors included. We did 250 sessions over 18 months, and with a union organiser present, by the way, which was part of our deal with ASDA. As you know, Walmart being one of the most anti-union firms on the planet, the only agreement to have, one of the only places to have an agreement in previously was in Northern Ireland. The result of that program was initially an increase in reports of sectarian and racist intimidation, because people felt comfortable to come forward, both to their employer and to our union reps, who are, by that stage, a lot more skilled up in terms of capacity and ability to deal with what are really challenging issues. And people are afraid of dealing with it, so usually they run for cover. And in the long term, it increased union density in those workplaces, and it increased BAME membership as those members became more confident in their union to defend them and represent them in the workplace. Now, alongside that ability and indeed our readiness, and that's the important thing, to intervene in these difficult situations and to build class consciousness in the space of what's called narrow nationalisms, we also work in the community, and that's also kind of a unique aspect of our work. Some of that work focuses particularly on the links between paramilitary organisations in Northern Ireland, obviously within loyalist paramilitaries for the most part, well, for all the part, and far-right groups in Britain. And now that's not a unique or a new kind of dynamic. From the National Front in the late 70s through BNP, Combat 18, now Britain First and the EDL, British far-right groups have always seen Northern Ireland as a kind of perfect breeding ground for their particular brand of hate-fueled politics. I use the word politics advisedly there. And whilst those links have existed, in our experience, they've never really taken root, and there are reasons for that I can go into later if you're interested. We'd argue that the contacts between the far right in Britain and the north have kind of been instrumental rather than institutional, based on one-off events or indeed individual friendships. You know, you might get British fascists come to Northern Ireland for the weekend where they get their photographs taken with a few flags and maybe a weapon or two, and they go home and they show off to their numpty mates across, over the weekend. The biggest change in the last couple of years has actually been in the Republic of Ireland, where we've seen the arrival of fascist narratives and indeed fascist organising. It's well worth stating that the explicit far-right organising of the type we're seeing has never existed really before in the Republic of Ireland. It's a relatively new political phenomenon. And whilst they've kind of singularly failed to achieve any meaningful political success, they do have a strong online presence, of course, but they're now beginning to make themselves felt on the streets, which is, of course, where we as trade unions have to meet them and face them down. And it's clear to us that these new fascist groups are part of an increasingly coordinated international effort, and that's the concern, with international money as well being used to pay for the activities they're engaging in. And what it does, and what it is doing, is normalising fascist and xenophobic language and beliefs across the country. And we see it everywhere, the same kind of repetitive themes and narratives and this kind of new international vocabulary that Richard referred to, the treacherous elite versus the people, and the people, of course, are all white. You've got the words of globalism, cultural Marxism, the great replacement, free speech, and all these terms are used specifically to refer to the same themes: anti-immigration and Islamophobia in Ireland, a particularly kind of conservative, misogynistic view of women, anti-abortion, and of course homophobia. And as in the workplace, our work as trade unionists in the communities in combating the far right is equally important. And I don't think we as trade unionists do that enough, if at all, in fact. Now, we would argue, and I know that a lot of you would agree, that a gap has opened up between our trade union institutions and the communities from which we come. Now, I know that there are loads of unions doing loads of great work in bridging that gap, but there has to be a recognition that the gap has emerged. Those traditional kind of working class kind of institutions of working class culture and life that were bedrock of trade unionism for the last 100 years have been decimated over the last 40 years during the neoliberal period, as their industries have been decimated. And as such, I'd argue that we're starting from quite a weak position in terms of challenging the rise of the far right in our communities. Quote from a mate of mine who wrote a great article last week. He said, the communities and institutions that produced 300 miners' libraries in Wales in the 1930s, thousands of working class reading groups and debating societies discussing how to change the world they lived in, they don't exist anymore. They're gone. And that's an issue for us. Over 100 years ago, Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, said that the problem of education is the most important class problem. And in that regard, I would say that we've taken our eye off the ball. If the left, if the trade union movement is part of the left, if we kind of fail to provide rational, progressive solutions to what are genuinely kind of growing economic and social traumas, particularly coming out of COVID, well, then the extreme right are going to walk into that space and they're going to provide irrational and reactionary solutions to those questions. Our responsibility is once again to do what we did so well in the past, is to embed radical political education back into our movement, and kind of with an aim of growing a cohort of young activists that are equipped with the understanding of how the world works, the tools to analyse, to critique that system that's doing so much damage to our communities, as well as advance genuinely progressive alternatives to how we might structure an economy. Richard referred to economic democracy, worker control. Those are debates we need to be having now. And in that way, of course, perhaps rather simplistically, if we want to defeat the right, we have to build the left. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much for those words, Stefan. I mean, obviously, one of the themes of this afternoon is how can we sort of change trade union education to actually give our activists the confidence to actually go out there and have those arguments. One of the things that the General Counsel have said to the TUC is that confidence is lacking. And clearly part of what we're trying to do in developing strategies is to work out how to actually get that confidence back. But I think, as Steve says quite rightly, if we're going to do that, it's about convincing people and equipping people to have the arguments about what we stand for as much as what the far right don't. So in that regard, education is really important. And I'm going to move on to our last speaker now. Jennifer Moses, who's a long-time friend, been involved in the trade union education business for longer than I can remember. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks for that, Wilf. Yes, I have been involved for a very long time, and I'm really grateful for having the opportunity to join in these conversations with sisters and brothers within the trade union movement and beyond. As a descendant of an immigrant family, first generation immigrant family, and now so-called second generation migrant family, my experiences within the workplace and out the workplace, within the workplace and outside the workplace has been disparate, but I have lived and worked through a plethora of reviews, of task groups, of audits across many governments that have looked at issues of racism and how racism, issues of social cohesion, and how these things can be addressed within the education sphere. The growing threat of the far right, and in the context of global pandemic, is quite serious, and I can hardly think of a time when this work around how we organise against the far right and far right ideology was ever more pertinent and relevant to the trade union movement and labour movement, as well as schools and education. So my contribution today will focus on schools and education. I'm a representative of the NASUWT Teachers Union, which has teachers and head teachers within its membership from right across the UK. So the issues of tackling the far right and of anti-racism work has been integral to the work of the NASUWT for many years. I have been working within the NSWT for over 20 years, and even as I came into the organisation, issues of tackling racism and far right ideology was very much on the platform of our work. So I was asked to talk about schools and education, and in the backdrop of the fact that Britain is now more ethnically, racially and religiously diverse than ever before, we all know, and there is strong evidence to suggest, that racial and ethnic inequalities, discrimination and racism remains entrenched, not only in our social life, but also within education. And far right activity has played a place in that, in terms of threatening the very fabric of the work that we're doing within schools and beyond. And in the context of a global pandemic, where people have been working in isolation, when groups have been isolated and not been able to meet and formulate, that anti-migrant and racist narratives have had the opportunity to grow through social media and other platforms. And so I think that we need to have a different way of organising around this growing narrative. And education is absolutely key to tackling these racist and far-right attitudes. Across the years, government education reforms have taken a backward step on racial equality in schools, not only for the pupils, but also for the workforce. And we know that there is a strong and marked absence of strategies to enforce the statutory equality duties that schools, colleges have to abide by, and a reluctance on the part of government to insist on good practice in schools. Due to government reforms, schools are now left to do their own thing rather than do the right thing. It is a key mission for all of our educators to enable all children and young people, irrespective of their background, to feel included in their schools and in their society, and education plays a real part in that. We really believe that children's learning experiences are not only influenced by what's included in the formal curriculum, but also what they learn through their life experiences, life at school and in school. So the work that we have been doing within the NASUWT, particularly around support for our Black teachers, and for the purposes of my input today, I will use the term Black as an inclusive term, as a political description of all ethnic minorities who have had a shared experience of oppression or racial injustice. So in the backdrop of data that we've had from our Black teachers that has shown that they have fared worse when it comes to pay and career advancement, they do not believe that they are paid at a level that was commensurate with their skills and level experiences. Migrant teachers are treated as non-teachers, non-qualified teachers, despite them having the relevant qualifications from the countries they come from. They continue to face overt and covert prejudice, harassment, and macro and microaggressions in their workplace. At a conference that we had this year, January this year, where we had almost 500 Black teachers present, nearly 2/3 said that they either, that racism, for them, racism had either worsened or remained the same over a period of 12 months. So it shows to us that we have a real problem and that there is no improvement in terms of racial justice. In 2016, we launched a campaign called Act for Racial Justice, and that campaign aimed to review the experiences of racial injustices, not only within education, but also in society, and called on governments to do the job in terms of tackling those racial injustices, and gave us, our union, a plan of action to tackle injustices, racial injustices, wherever it raised their head. But in terms of pupils, as I said before, schools should be supported in terms of fostering a culture of equality amongst the pupils that they teach. And it starts in the classroom in terms of the work that they do around the curriculum. But the curriculum is so restrained at the moment, and over successive governments, the curriculum has now been formed to have a look at topics that doesn't reflect the life and experiences of a large majority of children and young people. We and there are other organisations that are supporting a campaign and a move to decolonise the curriculum, where it would mean that the contributions and struggles and voices of Black children and Black populations are seen and heard within schools and mainstreamed throughout all areas of study and at all age groups. But the problem with the national curriculum as it stands is that 70% of our secondary schools do not have to follow the national curriculum as it stands, because they are academy schools. And so as part of that call to decolonise the curriculum, we need to ensure that it covers all schools, regardless of their nature, and so that no pupils are left behind in terms of the type of school that they have. When we're talking about other racial disparities, we know that there are issues around exclusion, where predominantly Black and Gypsy traveller pupils are more likely to be permanently excluded than any of the group. When we're looking at attainment, there are groups, whilst there are groups, Black groups such as Chinese and Indian groups that are excelling in education, which is great, there are still some Black groups, other minority ethnic groups such as Traveller, Gypsy, Traveller and Black Caribbean that are still continuing to fall behind in terms of that disparity, and they continue to be left at the bottom of the heap. And what can schools do about that? In the wake of the Stephen Lawrence Macpherson report in 1999, we had a piece of legislation, the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000, which imposed a duty on schools to promote race equality and also to collect incidents of racial discrimination and racist incidents. But successive coalition and Conservative governments have weakened that ability for schools to collect that information, and it's also not being policed or enforced, because we have a body, an Equality and Human Rights Commission, whose funding has been stripped out to the point where they're not able to do the job that they're set up to do. So we have a real problem here. And in terms of winding up, what do we need to do in terms of tackling this increased far-right activity, work for anti-racism, and particularly in the context of the global pandemic. We always argue within NASUWT that our work in this context has to be intersectional. We know that where you will find a racist, you will find someone who's misogynist, you will find a homophobe, you'll find a transphobe, an anti-Semite, and anyone with hatred or prejudice of disabled people. So it's important that the work that we're doing on tackling far-right activity and tackling racism has to be intersectional. And also, and it's what the last speaker spoke about, is that we also need to look inwardly. We need to look within our own ranks. We know from the statistics that there are people within the trade union movement that would have voted for a Conservative government. We know that there are people who would not share the views that we have of the half of the union around tackling racism and having an anti-racist narrative. So we need to make sure that we put our own house in order before we look at other groups that we're fighting against. And I think that the Black Lives Matter agenda gives us a real opportunity to not only look outwardly and turn the tide on racial injustice, but also look inwardly on what we're doing and calling out all forms of racial injustice wherever we see it. And in stronger terms, I think, we're facing the worst economic crisis that we'll probably ever seen in our working lives. There are going to be austerity measures that are on our doorstep, and that will further burden people on the grounds of ethnicity, on the grounds of class, on the grounds of gender, all the things that we know already, and also particularly attacks on our trade union rights, our rights to collective bargaining, our rights to justice. So I think we need a stronger and more forceful approach in tackling those things and facing the force of the emergency austerity measures that we're about to face. But I have hope, I really do have hope. As I said, the Black Lives Matter movement gives us that hope because it covers a wide spectrum of people from various groups who are now calling out these racial injustices, and the trade union movement has to be a real part of that movement and those calls. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Jennifer. We've got a little bit of time and we have got some questions in the chat, and I'll try and sort of direct them to people so we can get through as many as possible in the little time we've got remaining. And there is one which is sort of addressed to the TUC, which I will try and sort of cover in closing remarks. But one that I particularly wanted to pick up and ask Sarah about was a question that referred to the Black Lives Matter movement and the wonderful and inspiring job that those young activists have been doing. And the question really is, well, how can unions make themselves more visible at these protests and demonstrate the relevance of unions as part of that movement?
I think we could take some learning from the climate change activists and kind of how we've progressed as a movement to become more embodied within that movement. We can take some learnings from that, but I think, our members certainly have been contacted this week a number of times around, are we supporting the strike for Black Lives in America? What can we do as a branch? What can we do as individual members? It's very difficult in current times to kind of go on a march safely with your flags and your banners, but we are there. I think it's just we need to be better at telling people that we're there as trade unions, you know, sharing things on our social media platforms as national unions as well as individuals is a start. But when we get out of the crisis and we're into some sort of normal, you know, standing there on picket lines, joining marches, being visible as we can, you know, is what we need to do. But it is important to know that we are here and we are in support of the work that Black Lives Matter is doing, because we stand in solidarity with anybody going through struggle. That is what we do as trade unionists.
So, Stephen, just to follow on that from that, or abuse my position, have we got a problem in getting people to be proactive rather than just reactive? Steve?
I think the issue is one of capacity and ability and experience. That's the problem, is that, you know, we normally wait till the what's name hits the fan before we react to anything. That's kind of natural for most people behave like that. We're constantly, it's different, slightly different in Northern Ireland because of the intensity of the conflict here, but we were constantly warning organisations, including the trade union movement, you need to be ready for this when it inevitably occurs. You can't pretend this stuff is going to go away. Particularly now, as all of the speakers have said, because of the economic crisis we're facing, which is probably the worst we're going to see in 80 years, there is going to be people seduced by the ideologies of the far right, and we have to expect that to happen. So we have to start working now and stop kind of reacting, as you said, Wilf, when it's almost too late. And again, I'm going to re-emphasise the point I made before. Not all of that. Some of that is feet on the streets. It is about demonstrations. It is about supporting other movements and social movements like Black Lives Matter. But it also goes back down to political education, teaching people how the world works, teaching people that their lives and their material conditions aren't the fault of their black neighbour or of their immigrant neighbour. That's the issue. It's not complicated. We've done it before, but we've stopped doing it, I would argue. And we need to get back to doing it.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. There's a question here which I'll direct to Richard, which might seem a bit unfair, but which is in relation to Brexit and political agendas in Europe, which is clearly we're in difficult times. But the question is, do you think that we are looking into a very difficult time with the neoliberal model fast-tracked in the post-COVID world, despite climate crisis, fast developing and very dangerous world of rampant capitalism? And I think partly it's about a question about, well, how do we deal with the direction that many governments are going in, which, you know, although we've had this crisis which has highlighted many of the inequalities, it doesn't appear that for many governments that means a change of direction.
I think that we have an experience. Let me say it this way. We had an experience in the early 1990s, and the trade unions educated 20,000 activists promoting a policy against neoliberal approaches and so on. It was 20,000 getting into the companies, making discussions in there, making education, being at the front line, being at the shop floor, and so on. And I think we have to have this once again. We have to have this against the approach to overcome crisis by going back into austerity policy once again. And we have to combine it, I think, with the fight against the far right. So we have to have a concentration of economic policy and of political offensives against the far right. We have to combine this together, and we have to do it at the bottom. So therefore, I would suggest, let's start for Germany. Let's start again, educating 20,000 of trade union activists making these fights. And I think that could be an approach which is also educating inside the trade unions. It's a political approach for the public, but it's also an approach of advancing the political discussions in trade union once again.
Okay, so thanks for that, Richard. We're running out of time here, so I'm going to sort of make some closing remarks and try and answer the question which was put, the number one question put in the text box, which is the TUC addressing TU education and organising the left to the unemployed, which I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'll try and say a little bit about what the TUC is doing and where it is we're trying to go. I think firstly, it was important to have this session on tackling far-right ideology, because one of the things that we recognise at the TUC, this isn't a matter just about far-right groups, it's about far-right politics. And that politics is very much part of the mainstream. And that actually, if we don't deal with that, the political aspects, but just concentrate on those far-right groupings, then actually we don't address the issues that, we don't equip people with the arguments that they need to go out and have those hard conversations in the workplace. And to that end, we're doing several things. One is that we're trying to create regional networks and support those networks and get people working across unions and within communities, because for far too long, in many ways in the movement, we've been on this agenda working in silos. Secondly, we're creating a narrative project to look at not just what far-right narratives are, but what narratives have come out in the mainstream in terms of right-wing politics as a result of COVID, and what our response has to be to those. Thirdly, yes, we're developing some political education which we want to use to support those networks. And fourthly, we're working internationally. At the moment, we're trying to put together a project with IG Metall and the DGB in a couple of workplace locations in companies that work in the UK and in Germany, to get those workplace representatives to be working together to actually tackle some of the attitudes in the workplace. Obviously, we've got a range of things going on, but you know, it's all unions, all our affiliates, and it's also got to be about understanding that this just isn't about the UK, that it's an international problem, and it's part of an old struggle that we've always been dealt with. That struggle for progressive politics and against the right and against exploitation and inequality. So there's no easy answers. We've got a big battle ahead, but I think what's important is that we start having that proper discussion. We start actually having discussion with our reps about what the politics of this are, and encourage them to start advocating for progressive politics in their workplaces and their communities. Because if we don't, we leave a vacuum, and we've left a vacuum, I would argue, for quite a long time. And that's where right-wing ideas step in, whether it's from the BNP, whether it's from the Daily Mail, whether it's from Boris Johnson. Quite frankly, you know, you can't put these things in the box of just far-right extremists. Those ideas that are at the centre of this have always been the ideas central to the struggle about whether we want a world where actually the rich can exploit the poor, and that's it, and the whole purpose is about making money, or whether we want a world that's run for the benefit of workers. So can I thank you for joining the webinar this afternoon. you know, we will be, certainly in terms of the networks, putting information out there. And what we hope to do is run an event in October in terms of developing our strategy and links internationally. And also having contributions there from international speakers explaining what it is that they're doing and what's worked for them, and how we can build solidarity together. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for their contributions, for their great contributions. I'd like to thank you all for giving up part of your Saturday. The pressure's on nowadays, and it's good to get away from the screen, but you know, sometimes we have to participate in these discussions if we're going to move forward. So thanks very much for taking